In 1519, the crown of the Holy Roman Empire went to whichever man could pay for it. The price came to some 850,000 florins. More than half of that sum was lent by the son of a weaver from Augsburg, a man who never commanded an army and who chose an emperor anyway. This is Empires of Money, long, quiet histories of how the great fortunes were made and how they were lost, told slowly enough to fall asleep to. If you'd like the ledger opened again next week, the subscribe button is just below. Best to press it now while the lamp is still lit. There is a house in Augsburg that still stands, its rooms arranged as they were 5 centuries ago. The counting house where a man sat with his ledgers open, watching the slow accumulation of a fortune that, by some accounts, would make him the richest person who had ever drawn breath. Not in a time of plenty, but in an age when most men measured their worth in fields and cattle. He measured his in the weight of silver, in the promises of kings, in the trust that other merchants placed in a name written in a leather-bound book. His name was Jakob Fugger. He lived from 1459 to 1525, just long enough to see the shape of the modern world take form around him. Banking, mining, politics, faith itself, all of these things passed through his hands like the coins on the counting board that made the soft ring of money being born. He did not invent double-entry bookkeeping, though he mastered it in ways his competitors could not fathom. He did not discover silver or copper, though he became the man who fed Europe's appetite for both. He did not crown emperors, though twice his gold proved heavier than the armies arrayed against his debtors. What he did was gather thread by thread into a rope strong enough to hold kingdoms in place, and he did this by sitting still, by reading carefully, by knowing the difference between a risk and a ruin. We tend to celebrate the men who move mountains, but Jakob Fugger moved the ledger, and that was enough. Now close your eyes and listen. Dim the lamp. I'll keep the ledger. The city of Augsburg in the 1450s was not yet the place Jakob Fugger would make it. It was prosperous, yes. The roads that ran through it connected the Mediterranean to the Baltic, the North Sea to the lands beyond Vienna. Merchants gathered there, cloth traders and spice dealers, men who made their living from the thin margins of moving goods from one place to another. The Fuggers were among these men, but not yet the most famous. That would take time. Jakob's father, also named Jakob, called the Elder, had built something modest but solid. He was a weaver's son whose father, a weaver named John, had bought into the guild and learned the craft from wool to finished cloth. The Fuggers took the wool and wove it, then took the cloth to market. It was the kind of work that required patience and clean hands that could read a ledger as well as they could feel the quality of thread. By the time young Jakob was born in March of 1459, his father had already expanded beyond weaving into the broader trade of textiles, fustian, a blend of linen and cotton that came from the East and sold dearly in northern Europe. Jakob was not the firstborn. He had an older brother, and he had brothers born after him. In fact, he was the 10th of 11 children. In a merchant's household of the 15th century, position mattered. The firstborn son inherited the business. The younger sons were apprenticed out, given dowries with merchant houses in other cities, married off to strengthen alliances. Jakob, born into the middle of this crowd, would have seemed destined for precisely this fate, the useful middle son, no one's main responsibility. His father died when Jakob was young, and the business passed to the eldest. But something in the household, some whisper of ambition or necessity, caused his mother, whose name is lost to us now, to send young Jakob abroad. At the age of 14, he was packed onto a merchant vessel headed south, toward Venice. The journey took weeks. He would have watched the landscape change, the flat lands of Augsburg giving way to the Alps, then the descent toward the sea. He would have arrived in Venice, the most powerful trading city in Europe, with nothing but his education and his family's name. The Fuggers had connections in Venice. All Augsburg merchants did. There was a whole quarter near the Grand Canal where the German merchants lived and worked. The Fondaco dei Tedeschi, the warehouse of the Germans. It was a fortress of commerce, a building that looked like a castle but smelled of salt and spice and the careful accounting of profit. Inside, Jakob did not become a merchant in the traditional sense. He became something more rare. He became a student of how money moved. Venice in the 1470s was obsessed with a single innovation, the double-entry system of bookkeeping. It had been developed in the city-states of Italy over the previous century, a way of recording not just what you sold and what you spent, but of understanding where every penny was and why it was there. Most merchants at the time kept simple records: money in, money out. The Venetian system was different. Every transaction was written twice, once as a debit and once as a credit, creating a web of relationships between accounts that could only be balanced if every number was truthful. It was an architecture of truth built from numbers. Jakob was apprenticed to learn this system. For years, he sat in the counting houses of Venice, copying transactions into ledgers with a steady hand, watching the patterns emerge. He saw how the Venetian merchants financed their voyages to the east, how they pooled their capital to spread the risk across many ships instead of trusting everything to one. He saw how they extended credit and how they collected it. He learned the language of numbers so thoroughly that he came to speak it as naturally as he had spoken German as a child. This apprenticeship shaped him in ways that cloth weaving never could have. He was not learning to produce things, he was learning to make things produce themselves. Capital, once you understood it well enough, was like that. It could grow, could multiply, could be bent to serve your will, if you were careful enough, patient enough, and if you never made the mistake of thinking it was real. A fortune was a story you told with numbers, and the Venetian system was the only way to keep that story from lying. The years in Venice changed Jakob at a fundamental level. He came away not just with skills but with a philosophy. He had learned that commerce was not a game of competition where one man's gain was another's loss. Instead, he had learned that commerce could be a game of cooperation, where the right system allowed everyone to profit, where trust and accuracy created abundance rather than scarcity. This was a revolutionary idea for the time. Most merchants still thought of business the old way. You tried to cheat your trading partner before he cheated you. You kept your calculations secret. You guarded information jealously. But Jakob had seen something different in Venice. He had seen that transparency, that perfect accuracy, that binding yourself to standards of honesty that went beyond what the law required. These things created power. By 1487, when Jakob returned to Augsburg, he was in his late 20s, no longer the ambitious boy who had left. He was a man who understood money the way a physician understands the body, as a system of flows and pressures, of forces in equilibrium, of the careful balance between health and disease. He was a man who had learned to think in terms of systems rather than individual transactions. He understood that wealth was not something you accumulated and held, like a miser with his gold. Wealth was something you moved, managed, multiplied through careful administration and perfect record-keeping. He was ready to take what his family had built, the textile trade, the commercial connections, the network of relatives in distant cities, and turn it into something that would cast a shadow across all of Europe. He was ready to become not merely a merchant, but a banker. Not merely wealthy, but a maker of kings. The Fondaco dei Tedeschi was more than a warehouse. It was a school, a fortress, a city unto itself. The German merchants who lived there were subject to Venetian law, but governed themselves in their own affairs. They had their own chapel, their own kitchen, their own counting house. More importantly, they were immersed in the financial practices that had made Venice the richest city in Christendom. When Jakob arrived as a boy, the Fondaco was full of men haggling, writing, calculating. There would have been the smell of ink and old parchment mixed with the salt smell of the lagoon. The light would have come through high windows, and the whole place would have hummed with the sound of quills on paper, the scratch, scratch, scratch of accounting becoming real. The building itself was a fortress. Thick stone walls, small windows positioned to defend against attack from the street outside. Inside, there were storage rooms stacked with goods waiting to be sold or shipped. Cloth from Flanders, amber from the Baltic, spices in sealed jars whose value was higher, ounce for ounce, than gold. But what made the Fondaco truly remarkable was not what was stored there, but what happened in the counting house. It was there, in those rooms filled with ledgers and tables and calculating boards, that the transformation of commerce was occurring. The men who worked in the counting house were not soldiers or workers. They were accountants, clerks, managers, men who had learned to think in numbers, to see the world as a system of transactions that could be recorded, analyzed, and predicted. The Venetian system that Jakob learned was revolutionary for a single reason. It made dishonesty visible. Under the old way of keeping books, the way still used by most merchants across Europe, you could hide things. A merchant who wanted to steal from his partners could move money around, obscure where it went. He could claim that goods were sold for less than they truly were, or that more goods were purchased than actually arrived. A simple list of income and expenses could be manipulated by those skilled in deception. But with double-entry bookkeeping, every transaction created a trace that led both directions. Money had to come from somewhere and had to go somewhere. If those two places did not match perfectly, the system was broken. It was like a law of nature. The ledger could not lie without tearing itself apart. Think of it this way. If you claimed that you had sold cloth for 100 florins, that money had to appear somewhere, in the cash account, or in the account of money owed to you by the buyer, or in some other account. And if the money appeared in one of those places, it had to disappear from somewhere else, from the inventory or from a previous cash balance. If you tried to claim that you had sold cloth without having cloth in inventory to sell, the books would show the contradiction. You could not hide fraud in a perfectly kept double-entry ledger. This was the revelation that Jakob absorbed during his years in Venice. It was not just about keeping better records. It was about understanding that honesty and profit were not opposed to each other. A merchant who kept his books perfectly honest could be trusted with larger sums. A man whose books were impeccable could raise capital from other merchants who would lend to him on the strength of that reputation. In other words, honesty itself became an asset, like a warehouse or a ship. More than that, it became a tool, a way of binding other merchants to you, of creating networks of credit and mutual obligation that could span the Mediterranean. The other Fugger merchants who came to Venice during this time were family, relatives sent to represent the family interests. But Jakob stood out. He worked longer, asked sharper questions, and understood not just the mechanics of the system, but the philosophy behind it. He was not just recording the passage of money, he was thinking about why money moved the way it did, what forces compelled it, what rules it obeyed. He began to see that the ledger was not merely a record of what had happened. It was a tool for understanding what was possible, what would happen next. He also learned Venice's other great lesson, the power of distance. Venetian merchants had an empire not because they conquered land or kept large armies, but because they placed merchants in distant ports who could conduct business in their name. A ship from Venice sailing to the Holy Land did not make the journey and return with cargo. Instead, it established a connection, a line of credit, an understanding between the merchant in Venice and the merchant in Alexandria or Beirut. The merchant in the distant port would buy spices or silks, send them back, and the ledger in Venice would record all of this in double-entry form, creating a record that outlasted any single person. More importantly, it created a web of obligation. The distant merchant knew that if he defaulted on his debt to Venice, word would spread through the ports of the Mediterranean and beyond. No other merchant would trust him. His business would collapse. This too Jakob absorbed. The Fuggers, he understood, did not need to be the ones sailing the ships or mining the silver. They needed to be the ones financing the men who did these things and recording it all carefully in the ledger. They needed to be the men in the counting house who understood the system so completely that they could predict what would happen before it happened. They needed to understand that distance, properly managed through the mechanism of credit and reputation, was not an obstacle but an advantage. It allowed them to multiply their power across space, to be present in a dozen cities at once without leaving Augsburg. When he returned to Augsburg in 1487, he was a different man than the boy who left. He was no longer simply a merchant, a man who bought low and sold high, who made his profit through the sharp eye and the good deal. He was something new, a banker, a man who understood that capital itself could be the commodity he was trading. He was a man who understood that the modern world would belong to those who mastered the flow of capital, and he intended to master it completely. In 1487, the year Jakob Fugger returned to Augsburg, a nobleman named Sigismund, Archduke of Tyrol, faced a crisis that would reshape the course of European finance. Sigismund was a powerful man. His territory in the Tyrol region of what is now Austria and Italy contained some of the richest mineral deposits in all of Europe. He had silver mines at Schwarz, mines so productive that they had attracted workers from across the continent. Men came to the Tyrol to dig in the earth and grow wealthy. But Sigismund himself, despite owning the mines, was broke. This was not an uncommon situation for nobility in the 15th century. A title and land were not the same as ready money. Sigismund had spent lavishly, on horses, on women, on wars that did not go the way he hoped. He had financed a disastrous conflict with Venice, the kind of war that devoured money without ever rewarding it. By 1487 he was desperate in the way that only a powerful man without ready cash can be desperate. He had assets worth millions, and he had no way to convert them into the gold florins he needed to pay his debts. Jakob Fugger recognized the opportunity at once. In Venice he had learned the principle. Money was an intermediary between two goods. Sigismund had silver. The rest of Europe wanted silver. What Sigismund needed was capital, cash, florins that could be spent immediately. Jakob had the capital, or rather, he had access to it through the networks of merchants and lenders that the Fugger family had spent generations building. In 1487, Jakob made his first great transaction. He lent Sigismund 23,627 florins. For a merchant family of Augsburg, this was a significant sum, but it was not ruinous. What made the loan extraordinary was the security behind it. In exchange for the money, Sigismund granted Jakob the right to purchase silver from the Schwarz mines at a price significantly below what silver sold for on the open market. More than this, Jakob was given a controlling interest in how the mines operated. He could direct the workers, could decide which shafts to expand, could move investment from one mine to another. Sigismund got his cash and got out of debt. Jakob got something far more valuable. He got access to the raw material of power. Silver in the 15th century was like oil in the 20th. It was what the world ran on. Every coin was silver. Every important piece of jewelry, every ceremonial object, every piece of portable wealth was silver. To control the supply of silver was to control something that every kingdom, every church, every wealthy merchant wanted. The Schwarz mines would become, under Fugger management, one of the most productive mines in Europe. The ore there was rich and relatively easy to extract, and once Jakob understood how to finance the operation, how to bring in the best miners, how to organize the work so that no effort was wasted, the output of the mine increased steadily. Within a generation, the Schwarz mines would be producing more silver than any other mines in the continent, and the Fuggers would own the rights to purchase a substantial portion of it. But Jakob did not simply buy the product of the mines and sell it at a profit, though he did that too. What he did was use the silver as the foundation for a larger system. He would lend silver to kings who needed metal to mint coins. He would exchange silver for copper or spices or cloth. The ledger would record all of this, and every transaction would show a profit, or at least a careful accounting of the risk taken. The Tyrol silver deal in 1487 was the moment when Jakob Fugger transformed himself from a merchant's son into a banking dynasty. It was the first time he proved that he understood something profound, that capital was not wealth. It was the ability to move wealth from one place to another and to keep a careful record of where it had gone. A man who could do this could become wealthier than any king, not through conquest, but through patience and arithmetic. The monks at the monasteries in the Tyrol, who depended on the silver trade for their own wealth, would have heard the name Fugger whispered with growing respect. The nobles in Vienna would have begun to understand that when they needed money, they would have to negotiate with this man from Augsburg. They understood, without it being stated explicitly, that the Fuggers now held a key to their treasury. The other merchants, those who had seen Jakob as one of themselves, would have begun to understand that he was no longer quite one of them. He was becoming something else entirely, a man who had placed himself at the center of the flows of capital that kept Europe functioning. Other merchants bought and sold goods. Jakob bought and sold capital itself, the ability to move money, to borrow, to invest, to wait and calculate and place his resources where they would multiply. The Tyrol silver deal in 1487 was the beginning, but it was only the beginning. Jakob had learned the principle. Capital flowing into one place at the right time could transform everything. A bankrupt nobleman could become a powerful ally. A played-out mine could become a source of endless wealth. A man with nothing but a good reputation and perfect bookkeeping could become wealthier than kings. All you had to do was understand the flows, understand the timing, understand what people needed and when they would need it. And then you had to have the courage to lend them money. The lesson of Schwarz was that silver led to power, but power led to complications. Kings who owed you money began to believe that you owed them loyalty. Bishops who borrowed from you expected your financial support for their projects. The more successful Jakob became, the more he was pulled in all directions by men who wanted his money and believed that his money should serve their interests. By the 1490s, Jakob understood that he needed to expand beyond silver. The market for silver was growing, yes, but it was not infinite. There was only so much silver in the earth, and as more miners came to work the Schwarz operation, the competition for control increased. Jakob needed to find another source of wealth, something as fundamental as silver, but less thoroughly dominated by his competitors. That something was copper. Copper was not as precious as silver, but in some ways it was more valuable to the functioning of the economy. Copper was used for cooking pots, for bells, for ornaments, for coins, in regions where silver was not available. There was a constant, endless demand for copper, and it was less fashionable, less fought over than silver. A man who could control the copper trade could grow wealthier than any silver merchant, simply because copper would never stop being needed. In Hungary, in the region that is now Slovakia, there were copper mines that had been worked for centuries. The region around Banska Bystrica, which the Germans called Neusol, was known to be rich in copper ore. But the mines had suffered from a persistent problem: water. Groundwater seeped into the mines faster than it could be pumped out, flooding the shafts and making deep mining impossible. The mines had reached a natural limit. No matter how much ore lay beneath the water, no one could extract it. In the early 1490s, Jakob Fugger met a Hungarian nobleman named Johann Thurzo. Thurzo was a man of similar mind to Jakob. He saw that power in the modern age came from controlling the flows of capital, not from controlling land. Thurzo owned or had influence over several of the copper mines in the Neusol region, and he understood that without capital and technology, they would never reach their potential. In 1494, Jakob and Thurzo formed a partnership. More specifically, Jakob agreed to finance the implementation of new pumping technology in the Neusol mines. This technology, the product of generations of mining innovation in Central Europe, used a system of wooden wheels and leather pumps to remove water from the shafts. It required capital to build and required constant maintenance to operate. It also required the kind of precise accounting that Jakob had mastered in Venice, keeping track of costs, measuring output, calculating profit margins so thin that only perfect management could make them work. The partnership between Fugger and Thurzo would become one of the first truly modern business enterprises in Europe. By 1495, they had formed the Ungarischer Handel, the Hungarian Trade Company, or, as the Germans called it, the Neusohler Kupferhandlung, the Neusohl copper merchant. It was capitalized with Fugger money, managed with Fugger accounting practices, and it adopted innovations in mining and smelting that made it the most efficient copper operation in the world. The mines that had been semi-abandoned or worked only superficially because of the water problem were now opened deeper than ever before. Within a few years, the Neusohl operation was producing immense quantities of copper. By the early decades of the 1500s, the Fugger-Thurzo partnership was producing more than half of Europe's copper. Half. The entire copper supply of the continent was flowing through their accounting books, was being recorded in their ledgers in double-entry form, was being converted into profit. The profits were staggering. A single mining operation that had seemed played out became a source of thousands of florins per year. Multiply this across multiple mines, across multiple operations, and Jakob's fortune multiplied in ways that even the Schwarz silver operation could not match. Copper, because it was less fashionable, less fought over than silver, made Jakob richer than any amount of silver could have. But wealth brought a new complication. As Jakob's fortune grew, his role changed. He was no longer simply a merchant, a man who bought and sold things for profit. He was becoming a banker, a man who understood that capital itself was the commodity he was trading. Kings and princes began to see him differently. He was not just a source of loans. He was a man who could make things happen in the world by moving money. And that, of course, meant that they wanted him to move money in the directions they preferred. The Copper Mountain had made Jakob Fugger one of the wealthiest men in Europe by the end of the 1490s. The wealth was almost incomprehensible. The copper mines produced thousands of tons per year. That copper was sold across Europe to craftsmen and casters and weapon makers and everyone who needed the metal for their trade. Each transaction generated profit. Each profit was recorded carefully in the ledgers. The exponential growth that comes from compounding wealth, reinvesting profits to generate more profits, began to work its mathematics on Jakob's fortune. He was not just making money, he was making money that made more money. But the Copper Mountain had also placed him directly in the path of the great currents of history that were starting to flow through the continent. The Holy Roman Empire needed money. Kings needed money. The Church needed money. And Jakob, sitting in Augsburg with his perfectly balanced ledgers, had more of it than anyone else. Political powers began to see him not as a merchant, but as a resource. He was a man who could make things happen through the deployment of capital. He was a man who could finance wars, buy loyalty, alter the course of history. The question was not whether men would come to him asking for loans. The question was whether he could say no. And the answer, it turned out, was that he could not. Or rather, he could say no to some requests, but not to the important ones. Not to the emperor, not to the pope, not to the great powers that could make or break a merchant's fortune with a single edict. The election of an emperor was one of the few democratic processes in medieval Europe, and it was entirely for sale. The Holy Roman Emperor was not a king in the modern sense. He did not rule a consolidated state. Instead, he was elected by a group of princes, dukes, bishops, archdukes, who together held enough power to make an emperor's reign worthwhile or impossible. These princes had to be convinced to vote for a particular candidate, and they had to be convinced with money. It was not always bribery in the crude sense. Sometimes it was the promise of protection, or the reward of land, or the support of the emperor's forces in a dispute with a rival. But underneath all of this was money. The candidate who could bring the most wealth to the table was the one who would be elected. In 1519, the position of emperor became vacant. The previous emperor, Maximilian I, had died, and the German princes had to choose his successor. The two main candidates were Charles I of Spain, who was also Maximilian's grandson, and Francis I of France. Charles was young, ambitious, and the natural heir in the minds of many princes. But Francis was French, and he had French gold at his back. The election was shaping up to be expensive. Jakob Fugger, by this point in his life, was in his 60s. He had built his fortune over more than 30 years, expanding from the textile trade into mining, into banking, into the financing of the political machinery of Europe. He had lent money to Maximilian. He had profited from the silver mines of the Tyrol. He had grown wealthier with each passing year. But the election of 1519 would be different. It would be the moment when Jakob's wealth stopped being merely a personal fortune and became an instrument of statecraft. Charles I wanted to be emperor. He had the pedigree, he had the claim, he had the support of the German princes who benefited from Habsburg protection. But he did not have the money that would make the other German princes' votes inevitable. The cost of the election was estimated at roughly 850,000 florins, a sum so enormous that it was difficult even to contemplate. It was the price of convincing the German princes to vote for Charles, and it was also, perhaps more importantly, the price of preventing them from voting for anyone else. Jakob Fugger led a consortium of bankers who agreed to raise this money. The Welser family contributed, and Italian bankers contributed, but the Fuggers bore the largest share of the burden. By some accounts, Jakob and his firm lent approximately 543,000 florins to Charles, more than 60% of the entire cost of the election. This was not a small loan. This was not a sum that even Jakob Fugger could recover easily if Charles defaulted. This was a wager of the kind that could ruin him if he was wrong. But Jakob calculated that Charles was the better bet. Charles was young, he had legitimate claim, and most importantly, Charles would owe his crown to the Fuggers. A king who owed his crown to you was a king who would be very careful not to offend you. The election took place in June of 1519. Charles I was chosen as Holy Roman Emperor, and he took the title Charles V. Almost immediately, the moneylenders came to collect. Jakob Fugger sent a letter, not a formal demand, but a reminder. In 1523, 4 years after the election, Jakob sent a message to the emperor that has survived to this day. The letter does not survive in its original form, but the general sense is clear. Jakob was reminding Charles that the Fuggers had financed his election, that the promises Charles had made needed to be honored, and that Jakob expected to see a return on his investment. The tone of the letter must have been carefully calibrated. Jakob could not be too demanding, that might offend the emperor, but he could not be too modest, that might make the emperor think the debt could be delayed or minimized. The letter seems to have hit exactly the right note. Charles V began to honor the Fugger loans. He appointed Fugger men to positions of influence. He granted the Fuggers tax privileges and mining concessions. He acknowledged their service and compensated them for it. What Jakob Fugger had accomplished by financing the election of Charles V was something unprecedented. He had made himself, through careful application of capital and perfect calculation of risk, into one of the most powerful men in Europe. He was not powerful because he commanded armies or held territory. He was not powerful because he inherited a throne or had the blood of kings. He was powerful because he held the ledger that recorded what was owed to whom. He was powerful because an emperor had to negotiate with him as an equal, because a king had reason to fear the Fugger's displeasure. He was powerful because, quite simply, there was no one else in all of Christendom who had the money and the networks to do what the Fuggers could do. This was the transformation that the Tyrol silver deal and the copper mines had been building toward. Jakob was no longer a merchant in the traditional sense. He was not selling cloth or spices or any physical good. He was not even simply managing mines. He was something far more sophisticated. He was no longer a merchant, and he was not quite a king either. He was something new, a man whose wealth had become political power, a man whose ledger was more important than any crown, a man who could make emperors and unmake them through the careful deployment of capital. He was the first of a new breed, the international banker, the shadow power that stood behind the thrones of Europe. By the early 1500s, Jakob Fugger's power was woven so thoroughly into the fabric of European politics and finance that it was sometimes difficult to tell where his interests ended and the interests of kings and bishops began. He financed wars, he managed the collection of taxes, he arranged the marriages that united kingdoms. But in one area, Jakob's influence would eventually provoke a crisis that would shake Christendom itself. That area was the financing of the Church. The Pope in Rome was one of the most powerful figures in Europe, but like all powerful figures, he was constrained by the need for money. In the early years of the 1500s, Pope Leo X had a grand vision. He wanted to rebuild the great Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome, the largest church in Christendom. The basilica that stood on the site was ancient and crumbling. Leo X imagined replacing it with something magnificent, a structure that would dwarf any other building in Europe, and declare to the world the glory of the church. But the basilica would cost an enormous sum to build. The Pope did not have this sum in his treasury. He needed to raise it, and he needed to raise it quickly. The method that the Church had developed for raising money was the sale of indulgences. An indulgence was a piece of paper that promised the bearer forgiveness for sins, or rather, it promised the remission of purgatorial suffering after death. In the theology of the medieval Church, sins could be forgiven through confession and penance, but the consequences of sin extended into the afterlife. A soul that had committed sins, even sins that were forgiven, would have to suffer in purgatory before reaching heaven. An indulgence promised to reduce or eliminate this suffering. It was, in essence, a shortcut to paradise, and it was for sale. To finance the construction of St. Peter's, the Church announced a massive indulgence sale. Preachers were sent throughout Europe to sell these pieces of paper. The message was simple: buy an indulgence, and you or your loved ones would spend less time suffering in purgatory. For peasants and poor people, the cost was small, a few coins. For the wealthy, the cost could be substantial, but even then, it was a price most could afford. The money poured in toward Rome. In Germany, the Church arranged for the sale of indulgences to be handled by a consortium of bankers. And who was at the head of this consortium? Jakob Fugger. The Pope had learned, as every other ruler in Europe had learned, that when you needed money moved across vast distances and accounted for perfectly, Jakob Fugger was the man to call. The Fugger firm became the collection agent for the Pope's indulgence money. Jakob's men in every major city took the coins, recorded them in the ledgers, and sent them south toward Rome. This arrangement made Jakob wealthier still, but it also entangled him in the politics and theology of the Church in ways that he could not have anticipated. The indulgence sale in Germany also served another purpose. It was raising money to pay for the appointment of a bishop. A German nobleman named Albrecht of Brandenburg wanted to purchase a high position in the Church. Positions that could be bought and sold like any other commodity if you had enough money. Albrecht did not have the 30,000 florins that he needed, but the Church was willing to lend it to him. And who handled this loan? Jakob Fugger and his firm. In other words, Jakob's money was not just being used to build St. Peter's, it was being used to purchase ecclesiastical offices, to move money through the elaborate machinery of church finance, to enable transactions that, while legal and standard practice at the time, were increasingly beginning to trouble the conscience of more thoughtful Christians. In 1517, something remarkable happened. A monk and theologian named Martin Luther, living in a provincial German town, began to write about the theological problems with the sale of indulgences. Luther was not an opponent of the Church. He was a dedicated theologian, a man who wanted to purify the Church and return it to its scriptural foundations. But the sale of indulgences, he believed, was a profound spiritual corruption. The idea that forgiveness could be purchased was, he thought, contrary to the very essence of Christian faith. On October 31st, 1517, a date that would become one of the most important in European history, Luther wrote out 95 theses criticizing the sale of indulgences and, according to tradition, nailed them to the church door in his town. The gesture was meant to invite theological debate. Instead, it set off a chain reaction that would eventually split the Church and reshape the political landscape of Europe. Jakob Fugger did not understand, at the moment Luther's theses were published, that he was standing at the edge of a precipice. He was a businessman, a man who understood profit margins and double-entry bookkeeping. He understood that the Church wanted him to move money and collect interest, and he did these things with perfect efficiency. He did not see himself as participating in a spiritual corruption. He saw himself as participating in the construction of a magnificent building and the administration of a complex financial system. But the Reformation that Luther sparked would eventually undermine much of what Jakob had built. The wealth of the Church would be attacked and diminished. Kings and princes who had previously relied on papal authority would begin to assert their independence. The flows of money that had seemed so permanent would be disrupted, and Jakob Fugger, at the height of his power, would find himself in a position where his most reliable sources of capital were beginning to dry up. This, of course, was in the future. In 1517, when the Reformation began, Jakob was still in the prime of his power. The money would keep flowing, at least for now. The ledger would keep balancing. But the world that the ledger recorded was beginning to shake beneath it, and no one, not the Pope, not the Emperor, and certainly not Jakob Fugger, could predict where the ground would settle when the shaking stopped. In 1516, Jakob Fugger made a decision that would outlast his entire fortune. He founded an almshouse in Augsburg, a neighborhood of small houses designed to provide shelter for the poor and working people of the city. He called it the Fuggerei, and it was, by the standards of the age, a revolutionary act of philanthropy. The houses in the Fuggerei were not grand. They were small, modest dwellings, built in rows, each with a small garden where residents could grow vegetables or flowers. They were arranged around a central square, creating a contained little community. The idea was simple. Poor people, people who worked for a living but could not afford to pay much for rent, could live in dignity if someone else bore the cost of maintaining their housing. Jakob would bear that cost, not as charity, he was too shrewd a businessman to think of it that way, but as an investment in the moral economy of the city. The rent that residents paid was 1 Rhenish guilder per year. This was a sum so small as to be almost ceremonial. A worker could earn this much in a day or two of work. What Jakob was really asking for, more than the money, was something else. Residents of the Fuggerei were required to pray for the Fugger family, 3 daily prayers, the Lord's Prayer, the Hail Mary, and the Nicene Creed. They were to offer their prayers as payment for their housing. This was Jakob's way of converting wealth into what he believed would matter in the next life. He had spent his entire earthly existence converting capital into more capital, making money breed money through the mechanisms of double-entry bookkeeping. Now, in his later years, he was converting his wealth into prayers, into the spiritual credit that would, he hoped, offset the spiritual debt that a man of such enormous worldly wealth might owe. The Fuggerei was built and expanded beginning in 1516, with substantial additions made by 1521. By the time of Jakob's death in 1525, the Fuggerei contained dozens of houses, a small church, a kitchen where residents could gather. It was a statement by Jakob that his fortune was not merely personal, that some portion of his vast wealth was meant to ease the lives of those who had not been born into merchant families, who did not understand double-entry bookkeeping, who would never sit in a counting house looking over the Mediterranean. What made the Fuggerei remarkable was not just that it was built, but that it persisted. The houses remained in the Fugger family's hands, even as the family's fortune declined in later centuries. The Fuggerei still stands in Augsburg today, nearly 500 years after its founding. The rent is still 1 Rhenish guilder per year, now equivalent to less than a single euro, adjusted for inflation. The requirement to pray for the Fugger family remains, though interpreted more loosely in the modern world. Residents of the Fuggerei live there now, as they did then, in modest dignity, because a man who understood how to make wealth multiply decided that part of his fortune should stand still, should be converted into homes and prayers, rather than coins and credit. Jakob understood something that many wealthy men have never grasped, that immortality did not come from the size of your fortune. It came from the institutions you left behind, from the things that would continue to function according to your intentions long after you were gone. The copper mines would be worked out eventually, the silver would run down, kings and emperors would default on their debts. But the Fuggerei would endure, a small piece of Augsburg where the poor could live cheaply and pray for a merchant who had died centuries before they were born. The Fuggerei represents something that the double-entry ledger, for all its clarity, could never capture. The idea that a man's life was more than the sum total of his transactions, more than the balance that appeared at the bottom of a column of numbers. It was a final statement, carved into stone and brick, that said, "I am Jakob Fugger, and I did not believe that everything was for sale." Jakob understood something fundamental about power and mortality. He understood that a fortune could be lost. Wars could wipe out debtors. Emperors could default. Mines could run dry. The only thing that could not be taken away, the only thing that would outlast emperors and markets and the slow changes of the world, was an institution that served a purpose. The Fuggerei served the poorest of Augsburg. It asked for nothing but prayers. It offered nothing but shelter and dignity, and because it served this simple function, because it asked only what was within the reach of the poorest to give, it would endure. In a sense, the Fuggerei was Jakob's answer to the Reformation. The Protestant theologians were saying that the Church had become too worldly, too focused on money, too corrupted by commercial calculation. Jakob, the greatest merchant of his age, had built something that seemed to say, "I agree. This house belongs to the poor. The rent is nothing. The prayer is everything. No calculation, no negotiation, no ledger entry can measure what is exchanged here. It is pure gift, or as pure as a man like Jakob Fugger, a man whose entire life was lived in ledgers and calculations, could make it. The Reformation would split the Church and transform Europe. The Fuggers' wealth would eventually decline. Empires would rise and fall. But the Fuggerei would persist, a small pocket of mercy carved out by a man whose life was defined by the pursuit of profit. It was Jakob's contradiction and perhaps his redemption. By 1520, Jakob Fugger's power had reached a peak that would never be surpassed. The figure often quoted by historians, and it should be noted that it is an estimate, a modern calculation based on fragmentary records, is that his fortune was worth approximately 2 million florins at its height. To put this in perspective, the annual tax revenue of the entire Kingdom of England at that time was less than this figure. The annual budget of the Holy Roman Empire itself, one of the largest political entities in Europe, was smaller than the wealth concentrated in Jakob's hands. Jakob Fugger's personal fortune was wealthier than a nation, more liquid than any kingdom's treasury, and more reliable than any government's credit. This wealth was not idle. It was constantly in motion, flowing through the Fugger counting houses in Augsburg, Nuremberg, Venice, Rome, Innsbruck, Lyon, and a dozen other cities across Europe. Money coming in from the mines in the Tyrol and Hungary, money coming in from the financing of kings and bishops, money from the sale and trade of goods, money loaned out to merchants and princes, money held in reserve for the next crisis, the next opportunity. The network of Fugger agents, spread across Europe like a web of silk, recorded every transaction in identical books, so that at any moment Jakob could know exactly where his money was, what it was doing, and what profit it was generating. The Fugger family's correspondence network was as sophisticated as any government's diplomatic service. Letters were sent regularly between the branch offices, reporting on conditions in each city, on the creditworthiness of potential borrowers, on the health of the mining operations, on the political situation, and how it might affect the value of loans already made. These letters were in code. The Fuggers had developed a cipher so complex that no outsider could read them. The information contained in those letters, intelligence about wars before they were announced, information about the financial health of kingdoms before their credit collapsed, was worth millions in itself. By knowing what would happen before anyone else did, the Fuggers could position their money to profit from the future. The house that served as the family's base in Augsburg was a statement of their power. It was not a castle. The Fuggers were merchants, not nobles, and they understood the value of not appearing too grand, of not inviting the envy of princes. But it was a massive building, a palazzo in the Italian style, 4 stories tall, with a Renaissance facade and interior courtyards. It was filled with art and fine furnishings, paintings by the masters, sculptures, tapestries from Flanders. On the walls hung portraits of the family's ancestors, reminders of how far they had come from their origins in the weaving trade. Inside, the counting house where Jakob worked was lined with ledgers, each one recording a different aspect of the business. There were books for the mining operations, separate volumes for Schwarz, for Neusol, for each of the other mines in which the Fuggers held an interest. There were books for the banking transactions, records of every loan made, every payment received, every interest calculated and collected. There were books for the transactions with emperors and popes, books for the currency exchanges, books for the goods bought and sold. Each book was written in multiple copies, one maintained in Augsburg, one in the branch office, sometimes a third sent to another location. This redundancy was not inefficiency, it was insurance. If one copy was lost to fire or water or war, the other could serve as verification of the truth. The truth, recorded carefully and repeatedly, was the foundation of the entire system. Jakob's sons had begun to learn the business by this point, though his primary heir was his nephew Anton, who would take over the family enterprise upon Jakob's death. Anton was already being trained in the methods that had made the Fuggers great, in the careful reading of ledgers, in the assessment of risk, in the cultivation of relationships with powerful men. The family understood that their power depended not on any single man's genius, not on Jakob's exceptional talent, but on the continuation of the system. If the system was maintained, if the ledgers were kept with perfect accuracy, if the network of agents remained loyal and reliable, the wealth would continue to flow, even if individual actors changed. Jakob was not irreplaceable. What was irreplaceable was the method. The Fugger network had become, by 1520, something like a shadow government of Europe. When the emperor needed money, he negotiated with the Fuggers. When a bishop needed to finance a construction project or purchase an ecclesiastical position, he dealt with the Fuggers. When a prince needed to outfit an army, or a merchant needed to finance a voyage, or a city needed to rebuild its walls, they went to the Fugger offices. The Fuggers were not the only financiers in Europe, but they were the largest, the most reliable, the most trustworthy. More than that, they were the only ones with enough capital to meet the truly massive financial needs that arose. No one else could have lent 543,000 florins to finance an emperor's election. No one else could have maintained control of the entire copper supply of Europe. This trustworthiness was the foundation of everything. Jakob had understood, in Venice, that a perfectly balanced ledger was more valuable than gold. A man whose books were honest, whose calculations were precise, whose word was reliable, such a man could borrow any amount of money from other merchants, could raise capital for any venture, could become as wealthy as the god of all commerce might allow. Jakob had lived according to this principle for 60 years, and it had made him richer than anyone else in Christendom. But he also understood that this trustworthiness was fragile. It depended on the perception that Jakob would always pay his debts, would always honor his commitments, would always maintain the integrity of his word. If that perception changed, If even a whisper began to spread that the Fuggers could not be trusted, the whole structure would begin to collapse. But by 1520, there were cracks beginning to show in the structure that Jakob had built. The Reformation was spreading through Germany and beyond, challenging the authority of the Church and disrupting the sources of ecclesiastical revenue. Emperor Charles V was having difficulties with some of the German princes who resented Habsburg power. The Church's revenues, on which many calculations of future income were based, were being attacked and diminished. Worst of all, from the Fuggers' perspective, some of the most reliable sources of repayment for their loans were starting to look less reliable. Kings and bishops who had always paid their debts were beginning to struggle with the disorder that the Reformation was introducing into the world. Some were beginning to default, to delay payment, to negotiate for better terms.
Jakob was too old to be alarmed by this.
He was in his 60s, and he was not the sort of man to waste energy on worry. He had lived through the uncertain years of Sigismund's debt, through the rise of the emperor, through the early violence of the Reformation. He had always found a way to profit, to adapt, to position his money so that it would survive whatever came next. He believed, not unreasonably, that the Fugger system would continue to function even as the world changed around it. The system was strong, the ledgers were perfect, the network was secure. He did not foresee, no one could have, that the greatest threat to the Fugger fortune would not come from the Reformation or from the political upheaval of Europe, but from the very instrument that had created that fortune, the power of credit itself, extended too far, to borrowers whose kingdoms and empires were larger and more powerful, but whose ability to repay was in fact much less certain than it appeared. He did not know that he was standing at the apex of a curve that would bend steadily downward for centuries to come. Every loan, no matter how carefully structured, carries within it the possibility of default. Jakob Fugger understood this as well as any man who had ever lived. The whole system of double-entry bookkeeping, the entire architecture of the Fugger enterprise, was designed to account for this risk, to distribute it, to manage it, so that one bad debt would not bring the whole structure crashing down. The Fuggers kept reserves. They diversified their lending across many different borrowers. They maintained partnerships with other bankers so that large loans could be shared across multiple firms. The system was resilient, or at least it had been designed to be resilient. And yet, the nature of the Fuggers' business, lending to kings and emperors, meant that they were constantly accepting risks that no ordinary merchant would dare accept. When an emperor promised to repay a loan, was there any power on earth that could force him to do so? An emperor was not bound by the laws that governed other men. If he decided he would not repay, what could the Fuggers do? Sue him? Seize his assets? The idea was almost absurd. You cannot take a lawsuit against the Holy Roman Emperor. You cannot send agents to seize the imperial palace. An emperor's power rested on the ability to command armies and inspire loyalty. If he decided that the Fuggers' claim was not worth honoring, what recourse did they have? What kept emperors paying their debts to the Fuggers was reputation. A king or emperor who defaulted on a loan would find that no banker in Europe would lend to him again. The Fuggers' letterbooks and networks would spread the word through every counting house and merchant quarter in Christendom. The emperor would find himself isolated, unable to finance his wars or his building projects, unable to maintain his power. He would be unable to hire armies. He would be unable to buy supplies for his campaigns. More than this, an emperor who defaulted on his debts to his merchants would be seen as weak and dishonorable, a violation of the most basic principles of honor that governed the dealings of powerful men. Other monarchs would lose respect for him. His nobles would begin to doubt his ability to reward loyalty. The whole intricate web of obligation and honor that held a realm together would begin to fray. But by the early 1520s, this system was beginning to show strain. Charles V, the emperor whom the Fuggers had financed into his position, was already beginning to have difficulties repaying his debts. The wars that came after his election were expensive, far more expensive than had been anticipated. Charles found himself fighting on multiple fronts, against the Ottoman Empire in the east, against Francis I of France in Italy, against the Protestant princes in Germany. Each war consumed money at a rate that even an emperor's resources could not sustain. The church's revenues, on which many calculations of future income were based, were beginning to be disrupted by the Reformation. Fewer people were buying indulgences. Fewer lands were being donated to the church. The flow of money that had seemed so permanent and reliable was beginning to dry up. Charles V found himself in the position that had confronted every other powerful man who had borrowed from the Fuggers. He owed more money than he could easily pay. He owed the Fuggers for the election. He owed them for the subsequent loans that had financed his wars. He owed them for the interest that accumulated on these debts, and he had no clear way to repay any of it. His income from taxes was substantial, yes, but it was not sufficient. The flow of gold and silver from the New World was increasing, but it was still years away and uncertain. Jakob Fugger's response to this crisis was to extend more credit. In the world of high finance, sometimes the only way to rescue a bad situation was to throw more money at it, to give the debtor more capital to work with, hoping that they would be able to generate enough surplus to eventually pay off the original debt plus the new debt. It was like a man drowning in debt taking on another loan, hoping that the new money would somehow create enough profit to repay everything. It was a dangerous game, and Jakob was old enough to know it. But he also understood that if Charles V fell into financial ruin, if the emperor could not finance his wars, if he was forced to default on his debts, it would be catastrophic for the Fuggers. Better to keep lending, to keep supporting the emperor, in hopes that eventually circumstances would improve, and Charles would be able to consolidate his empire and generate enough revenue to repay. This pattern would continue for the rest of Jacob's life and beyond. The emperor would need money. The Fuggers would provide it. The emperor would find himself unable to repay. The Fuggers would provide more money, extending the terms, reducing the interest, restructuring the debt. It was a cycle that could not continue forever. Eventually, there would be enough debt accumulated that no amount of future income could pay it back. Eventually, the debtor, in this case the most powerful man in Europe, would default. And when that happened, the Fugger fortune, vast though it was, would begin its long and irreversible decline. Jacob did not live to see this decline. He died in 1525, only 6 years after financing the emperor's election, before the full consequences of his decision to keep lending to Charles V became apparent. He did not live to see the day when the vast machine he had built would begin to rust and break down, when the confidence of merchants everywhere in the Fugger name would begin to waver, when the ledgers would still balance perfectly, but the numbers they contained would mean less and less. But his heir, his nephew Anton, would inherit a fortune that looked solid and eternal, but was already beginning to crumble from the inside. Anton Fugger was a skilled banker, well trained in the methods that had made Jakob wealthy. He expanded the fortune further, taking it to even greater heights. By 1546, Anton had increased the family fortune to over 5 million florins. But this apparent growth masked an underlying fragility. The debts of Charles V were not being repaid. The Reformation continued to spread, reducing church revenues further. The world was changing in ways that the traditional methods of banking could not easily adapt to. The Fuggerei would endure, the Fugger name would remain in the history books, but the extraordinary wealth, the position as the richest men in Christendom, the power to make emperors dance to their music, all of this was coming to an end. Not immediately, not all at once, but the seeds of the decline had been planted in those early years of Charles V's reign, when Jacob made the fateful decision to keep lending money to a debtor who could never really repay. The emperor would default, not once but repeatedly throughout his reign, and when the Spanish Empire, the greatest empire of the age, declared bankruptcy in 1557, just 32 years after Jacob's death, the Fugger fortune would be decimated. The richest men in Europe would become merely wealthy, and the age of the merchant princes would begin its long, slow sunset.
Jakob Fugger died on December 30th, 1525. He was 66 years old. He had lived through the discovery of the New World, the rise of printing, the beginning of the Reformation. He had seen Europe transformed by forces far greater than any single man, and he had found a way to profit from that transformation. He had made himself richer than kings, more powerful than many princes, wealthier than nations. When he died, his fortune was estimated at over 2 million florins, more than half of all the money that circulated in Europe in a single year. His will distributed this vast sum carefully, ensuring that it would be preserved and managed according to the principles he had established. His nephew Anton inherited the bulk of the fortune and the responsibility for continuing the Fugger enterprise. For a time, it seemed as though the system would continue unchanged. Anton Fugger was a capable manager, well trained in the methods that had made Jakob wealthy. The family's operations continued. The mines produced silver and copper, the loans were made to kings and bishops, the ledgers were kept with perfect precision. By 1546, Anton had increased the family fortune to over 5 million florins, a sum almost impossible to comprehend. But the cracks that Jakob had seen only dimly were widening. The Spanish Empire, built on the influx of gold and silver from the New World, was consuming more than it produced. The wars in Europe were becoming more expensive and more frequent. The Church, weakened by the Reformation, was generating less revenue than it once had. And underneath it all, the emperor's debts continued to accumulate. In 1557, the Emperor Philip II of Spain declared a partial default on his debts. The Fuggers held nearly 1 million florins in Spanish bonds. The default did not wipe out this sum entirely, but it was a severe blow, and it was not the last blow. Over the following decades, through a series of Spanish bankruptcies and defaults, the Fugger fortune was systematically eaten away. The family remained wealthy by ordinary standards, but they had fallen from the peak. They would never again be the richest men in Europe.
By the end of the 1500s, the family's fortune had declined to perhaps a tenth of what Jakob had accumulated. By the 1700s, the Fuggers were still important merchants and still wealthy, but they no longer dominated European finance. Other banking families had risen to take their place. The Medici of Florence, the Welses of Augsburg, and later the Rothschilds of Frankfurt would carry forward the business of international finance that the Fuggers had pioneered. But the Fuggerei remained. The little houses in Augsburg, unchanged since Jakob's day, continued to shelter the poor and working people of the city. The rent stayed at 1 guilder per year, even as inflation made that sum nearly meaningless. The chapel remained, and residents continued to pray for the Fugger family long after anyone remembered why they were praying, long after anyone could calculate how many prayers it would take to balance the spiritual scales for a man who had accumulated such enormous worldly wealth. The counting houses fell silent. The ledgers stopped being written. The network of Fugger agents that once spanned from Venice to Antwerp slowly dissolved. The names and faces of the men who had made the system work were forgotten. And yet, something remained. The idea that Jakob Fugger had carried from Venice, that capital was a force that could be commanded by men who understood the rules of its movement, that wealth could be accumulated through careful arithmetic and perfect honesty, that a man without soldiers or land could become more powerful than any king. This idea did not die. It passed into the world. It became the foundation of modern banking, of capitalism itself. Every businessman who has ever kept careful records, every merchant who has understood that reputation and reliability are worth more than gold, every banker who has extended credit based on the belief that tomorrow's profits would justify today's loan, all of these are, in a sense, disciples of Jakob Fugger. The Fuggerei still stands. It is nearly 500 years old now. The houses are small, the rent is trivial, but they are still occupied by people who cannot afford to pay more. 300 people, perhaps, live in the Fuggerei now. They are not aware of Jakob Fugger's calculations. They do not know the double-entry ledgers. They do not understand that they are living in a house maintained according to the principles of a man who died 5 centuries ago. But that is what remains. Not the fortune, that is gone, burned up in the defaults of Spanish kings and the long decline of the House of Fugger. Not the power, that is gone too, surrendered to other men who learned the lessons that Jacob taught. Not even the memory, which grows dimmer with each passing generation. What remains is the institution. The Fuggerei is no longer an act of charity. It is no longer proof of Jacob's piety. It is simply what it is. Houses where people can afford to live, rent kept impossibly low, maintained by the will of a man who wished to prove that not everything is for sale. In a sense, it is the perfect monument. Not a statue, not a grand building bearing his name, but something so simple and so practical that it seems almost to disappear into the fabric of ordinary life. A merchant's greatest achievement, in the end, was to make something that would work forever, that would continue to serve its purpose long after the ledgers had crumbled to dust. And that is what remains. Sleep well.